Welcome to week 1 of Heschel. This is a really exciting class. I love reading Abraham Joshua Heschel, and my hope is that you will too. He is a very poetic writer, and on the one hand, as such, he's very easy to read, but also he's very difficult to read, as we're going to experience. We have 5 weeks, I think. Every week, I'm trying to focus in on sort of one theme. It's hard to do because everything that he writes, as we'll see, sort of meshes into everything else. There's no clear cut, well, this book is on this and this book is on that. You can do it a little bit, but not a lot. And it's a survey course. Heschel was a nonstop writer, a nonstop speaker. Obviously, we're only going to cover a sliver of his output, but I hope from that you have a sense of who he was as a human, who he was as a Jew, and his contribution to Jewish life. Last year was actually commemorated the 50th Yortzeit for Heschel. He died in 1972, and he was 65 years old. And oddly, actually, the conservative movement didn't really do a whole lot. There was no major conference on Heschel's thought at JTS, which you would think would have happened for someone whose almost his entire career was there. Surprisingly, the people who did write about him a lot actually were the Orthodox. While he didn't get a lot of traction in the Orthodox world during his lifetime, it's clear that in the last 20 years, he's become more and more popular. So let's pass these around and give you a little bit of a bio. And some of the stapling worked, some didn't work. So I don't maybe ran out of staples. That's good. That should be enough. And if not, I got a couple more. So Abraham Joshua Heschel. Abraham Joshua Heschel was born in 1907 in Warsaw. Into a Hasidic family. In fact, not just any Hasidic family. Yes, the materials would have already been emailed to you. If they're not there, they'll be there very shortly. He was part of a Hasidic dynasty. He's named after his great-great-grandfather, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is also known as the Apter Rav. So he was the Rav of Apt. And from a very young age, it was recognized that Heschel was what we call an Ilui, a child genius. From a young age, people would come and to hear him speak. His bar mitzvah, he gave a drasha that attracted the rebbes from all over. He was that kind of child. In case I forget to say it later, English was, I think, 5th language, right? So he spoke Yiddish as his native tongue, Polish, of course. He spoke German. He went to school in Germany. What am I missing? Hebrew. And English he only started studying once he was at the university level. And then he moved to London for about a year. I'll go through his bio in a second, and then ended up in New York. So English is his 5th language. He writes in English better than almost any other native English speaker that I know. I had a classmate at the seminary who converted to Judaism when he was 18. He was Catholic. He was actually sort of in the track to become a priest. He was from Columbia. And it made me crazy because he was in my Talmud class, and his Talmud skills are better than mine. And I'm like, seriously, this is not fair. Anyhow, Heschel faced anti-Semitism as a kid growing up in Poland in the beginning of the 20th century. The family was poor. His father passed away soon after World War I. Yep, thank you. As a result of the Spanish flu. And he was really care was given, obviously his mother, but also an uncle of his. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of heat in their home. And actually Heschel's hands were permanently swollen from the frostbite that he experienced as a child. His home wasn't cloistered, in the sense that the learning that they allowed for and the conversations that they had weren't just on Hasidic texts or rabbinic texts. Their household was open to ideas of the Enlightenment, which was now, making its way into Poland from Germany, now that we're at the beginning of the 20th century, and Zionism as well. And Heschel himself was a Zionist, and in fact, later on in life, when he was already very much active in social justice circles, he was a defender of Israel after the Six-Day War, when it wasn't always in that milieu so popular. He was ordained when he was 16. Not bad. He was the first in his family to go to university. This is a big deal. It's very different than like now first-generation university students just coming out of the Hasidic world. It wasn't obvious that was going to be his pathway, but his family was open to it. He went to Vilna for a while, Vilna being a real center of Jewish life. 40% of the population of Vilna at the time is Jewish. YIVO, the great Yiddish institute, is based in Vilna. There's strong secular thinking, strong Zionist thinking, and also strong religious thinking. And all of this, Heschel just assimilates and assimilates and assimilates. He's not a social person at all, but he is happy to sit with books and happy to read newspapers and happy to sit and have conversations and learn. Goes to Vilna, goes to Berlin. He studies philosophy, he studies Semitic languages. He ultimately writes his dissertation on the prophets. His book, The Prophets, which was published considerably later and after some of his major works, is in some ways an expansion on the doctoral dissertation. He was actually at the opera one evening in 1938, I think it was, maybe it was a little earlier, and Hitler came in, and everyone stood and saluted, what have you. And this was Heschel's recognition that things were not going to be good for the Jews. And he was actually, him and something like 18,000 other Polish nationals, Jews, were expelled from Germany, and he was expelled back to Poland in 1938. He is fortunate. He is able to find his way to London, and ultimately he's sponsored by Hebrew Union College to come to the United States. And as a result, he misses the war. His mother dies from a heart attack when the German Gestapo police, basically, they come into the apartment, they charge in, and she dies. He has 3 sisters, none of them survive. One dies in Treblinka, one dies in Auschwitz, and I'm not sure about the third. In Europe, he befriends Martin Buber. He actually takes over from Buber, the leadership of an Jewish institution in Frankfurt. He challenged himself to learn English with a tutor and by reading the London Times and, believe it or not, reading Roget's Thesaurus. Wanting to every day, challenging himself to learn 10 to 12 words.
Wow. My book doesn't stay on top.
not the easiest thing. Sorry. Gets to New York. Obviously, he's not at home at HUC. This isn't exactly his people. He gets that there's still a very strong sort of Central European German academic approach, which really, as you'll see, is not him at all. But he was grateful. And when he leaves 6 years later, after he gets an offer from JTS and the Jewish Theological Seminary, he expresses gratitude, but some people were sort of put off by the fact that they saved him and he left, but so it is. He meets and marries Sylvia Strauss. He gets married, he's 39 years old. She's 6 years his junior. And they have one child, Susanna Heschel, who is currently a professor of Jewish studies at Dartmouth and has been, on some level, responsible for continuing her father's legacy, but she's not the only one who's done that. He befriends, Elie Wiesel, and he befriends, the people who you can imagine he's going to be friendly with, he's friendly with. People he's not friendly with is a lot of the faculty at JTS. He clashes horns. And it wasn't just on academic level. There were sort of cliques of students. They were the Heschel people, and they were like the Mordechai Kaplan people. And there were very, very different approaches to Judaism, approaches to learning and scholarship. And the words that they shared with each other were not particularly great. He clashed with Saul Lieberman, who at one point not just taught, he was actually, I think, the dean of the rabbinical school, which got him into some trouble with the Orthodox. He was also deeply ecumenical. He was highly involved in interfaith conversations, particularly conversations with Christians, of course. At some point, he's actually appointed as visiting professor of Union Theological Seminary, which is a Protestant school kitty corner to JTS. I loved going to the library there. As a student of JTS, we had access to their library because it was 6 floors and it was dark. It was a motion sensor lights. There are gargoyles everywhere on campus. And the way the stacks are built through the floors. So you could actually see from the 6th floor all the way down. And I was always afraid of dropping a book by accident. It never happened, thankfully. He, in this front, being ecumenical, he became involved in the Second Vatican Council that ultimately led to much better proclamations about the Jews and not needing to convert and deicide and all those things. In fact, his initial involvement was top secret. Nobody knew, and it was like Erev Yom Kippur, and there was a private audience with the Pope, cloak and daggers kinds of thing. And when it got out there, there was some anger. The Orthodox really didn't believe, as many of them still don't believe, that there should be theological conversations between Jews and anybody else. And there's also the, who appointed you as king of the Jews to negotiate on our behalf? Ultimately, it was much more public. He had a good relationship with Pope Paul VI, who, when he would meet him, would give him like hugs and tell him how much he's enjoying his books and all those things. So, really up there. And his detractors would say he's a great rabbi for the Christians. That and people like Paul Tillich and Tillich and others big names in Union and in the Catholic world, they loved him and quoted him and wrote reviews of his books, and he was very popular, still is popular in certain Christian circles. Jewish circles was a bit of a different feeling. He was someone who always moved at full speed. He didn't know how to stop. He didn't know how to take a break. He didn't have hobbies. He didn't really vacation. He worked and he taught and he wrote. Even his classes, I'm told, were off. He didn't have a great pedagogical style. Sometimes he would, Farrar Strauss-Giroux was his publisher. Like, he would sit in class reading to his class the proofs of the book that's being published, looking for errors. Fine, maybe not the best teaching style. And he was very involved in civil rights. This started with his engagement in civil rights with respect to African Americans in the United States and their status. Famously, he marched arm in arm with Dr. King in Selma. Right. And after which he said, I felt like my legs were praying. He had I think we're going to look at a telegram he sent to JFK prior to a meeting he had with him and some other religious leaders, specifically on this issue. And he had a lot of writing on this, which is really phenomenal and fascinating. And then his engagement with civil rights moved towards Vietnam. He was in active opposition to the war. He founded a clergy organization, interfaith opposition to the war. But at the same time, the Rabbinical Assembly at the time had a requirement. In order to become a member, you first had to do military chaplaincy. And in fact, even when I was there, and then Bill Lebo was the dean for the first couple of years, he really pushed everyone, because he was a chaplain, saying how important it is. And it's important.
Did you do it?
I did not. It's actually sidebar. Okay. I looked in the United States. You can't, as a Canadian, because it's an officer, I couldn't do anything there. As a student, they actually had a very good student structure, which I actually have a bunch of friends who did it as a student, because there's no, if you do it as a student, you don't have to really make any commitments. You're just there for those 2-3 months, and if you want to do it again, you can do that. And then, it's only once you're ordained, you have to make decisions about, are you going to enlist, and if so, full-time or part-time. You can do it part-time in a way for most of the branches of the military that you're there sort of in chunks of time. So Aaron, who is a chaplain with the Army.
Illinois National Guard.
Illinois National Guard. So he's able to sort of do things in chunks. And in terms of organizing one's schedule, that's much easier. And most of the time, congregations are proud of the rabbis doing this kind of work. Here, it doesn't work that way. At some point I looked into it. It's like the commitment was every Sunday for 8 hours and one evening a week from like 4 to 8 or 4 to 9. It's just, it wasn't like, and there's an armory like right here. It's perfect, but it's not feasible, unfortunately. The organization that he founded with respect to Vietnam. So back to the Rabbinical Assembly. A lot of the students turned to him and they said, we don't want to serve. We're opposed to the war in Vietnam. We don't want to become military chaplains. And he was convinced by the administration to sort of gather all the students together in what was called the Green Room at the time, and basically convince them, saying, being a chaplain doesn't mean that you condone the war. Being a chaplain means that you're there for the Jewish soldiers. And let me show you the letters on my desk I'm getting from Jewish soldiers. They need you. And in so doing, he was able to get them to serve and get them in the RA. The organization that he founded that was anti-Vietnam was actually surveilled by the FBI for a while. Not a surprise. And it's arguable that on some level, his writings and his standing up against the war did sort of trickle down into the Jewish youth at the time. And we know that Jews were considerably overrepresented in anti-war demonstrations. He had a meeting with Defense Secretary McNamara. At some point, he went prophetic on him. He just unleashed on him like he was Jeremiah. And that sort of ended the meeting. He also had a meeting with Kissinger, who he had a lot in common with in terms of being a refugee, et cetera. And he said, how could you as a Jew prosecute war like this? And again, that was basically the end of the meeting. And towards the end, he was in ill health. It wasn't a surprise that when he died, but it was still deeply sad, of course. And he was young, 65. And he was survived by his wife, who ultimately passed away, and Susanna, who's now older. There has been actually a sudden surge in literature on Heschel. So a great and readable biography is by Julian Zelizer. It came out 2-3 years ago by Yale University Press. On a more theological sort of reading of his texts, this is by Shai Held. Shai Held is a conservative rabbi, Harvard PhD, one of the founders of Hadar. I sometimes actually quote from him when I'm speaking because he has a great commentary on the Parshiot. Great guy, and a chance to learn with him at JTS and actually other places as well. We overlapped in the Wexner Fellowship. Also very recent. This is more academic. Michael Marmer, Abraham and Joshua Heschel, and the Sources of Wonder. I haven't read it deeply. I've sort of flipped through it a bit. It's good, but you should read Heschel before you read this one.
It doesn't have as many tags.
That's exactly. And this is sort of round number 2. Edward Kaplan, who was one of his students and acolytes, wrote, it's not even biography, it's like hagiography of him. It was a little too loving. This is another edition of it, which is a little bit better in terms of not just being totally in love with Heschel. And if you go upstairs, there's like a whole other bookshelf of Heschel in my office. What time is it? 6:26. We only have 12 pages to read through, so we're plenty of time. So we're going to look a lot today.
Rabbi,
yes.
I believe he was Rabbi Salzman, God's rest his soul, teacher. Because I remember.
I have no doubt that Rabbi Salzman had him as a professor. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to look a lot today at God in Search of Man. And if you were to read only 2 books from Heschel, the first one should be The Sabbath, which you can read in an hour or less. Great book, and also like immediately relevant in your lives, because I think we all here have observed the Shabbat in one way or another. And then the second book I'd put on your list is God in Search of Man. So that's what we're looking at largely today, although there's actually 3 different books that I've highlighted for you. And today I'm really focusing on texts that are the starting point for Heschel. How does Heschel see the world? How does he relate to God and Judaism? What's his starting point, and how does it differ from the starting point of philosophers, for example, and certainly academicians? So this is how he begins God in Search of Man, to recover the questions, and questions are at the center of Heschel's thought. It is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the cliffs of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. He is very critical of organized religion.
Really?
For someone who is certainly a halachically practicing Jew, 100%, he is very critical of all organized religion, and especially the Jews. He really, and he was the keynote speaker at rabbinical assembly conventions, and just went to town. Now, it was easy because he didn't have a congregation, right? There's a bit of ivory tower in there, and when I read him, I often think, how much this is applicable today, and it's like 99.8%. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, insipid. When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. What jumps out to you from this paragraph?
Well, is that the reason why we're having a decline in involvement in?
Well, what do you think?
It may well be the reason why people are not as engaged in their Judaism as they were in the past. Possibly.
Okay. This is back written when?
He publishes this in the early 50s.
Early 50s. So that's a long time.
Yeah,
Okay.
2 generations.
Yeah. So I think you have to look. You have to always keep things in perspective with what's happening at the time.
Right.
And actually, at the time, it sort of was growing.
55.
Wow.
That's interesting.
But,
Yeah, so we're
the synagogue became
right. So Jews are moving to the suburbs.
Right.
The war, the Holocaust, by the way, I should have mentioned this, he rarely addresses it directly, but it clearly haunts everything that he writes. So Jews are suburbs, they're casting off religious practice left, right, and center, and synagogues are becoming large edifices, right? He lives at 425 Riverside Drive. So it's Riverside and around 114th Street, right by Columbia, very close to JTS. And his preferred place of davening is the local Hasidic shtibel. He goes there, but he also will daven at JTS, with his colleagues from time, not irregularly. And it's worth mentioning, when his daughter was soon to become bat mitzvah, she said, I want to have it on Shabbat morning, and I want to read the Haftarah, which at the time was not officially sanctioned by conservative Judaism.
Yeah.
And he never saw himself as a conservative Jew either. He saw himself as Heschel. And he said yes, and that's what she did.
Wow.
But he was comfortable davening at the Orthodox.
He preferred it.
He preferred
it. I think he actually said there's something along the lines of, I I can't talk to the people I pray with, and I can't pray with the people I talk with. Something along those lines.
Interesting.
I think there's a great deal of truth in that first paragraph.
What in particular, if anything, jumps out to you?
I think, I don't know if I would pick out anything in particular. I think that every comparison that he makes down the line is, absolutely accurate. That in my experience, the quality of Judaism seems to have been wrung out by many of the practices. The davening that I remember hearing as a teenager, for example, it was just, and no depth of feeling, no sense of the words, no questioning, no compassion. I think his first paragraph is absolutely correct and shocking.
Okay. So let's keep going then. Religion is an answer to man's ultimate questions. So I think that there is a lot in the "and." Heschel was, and this again got him into trouble, a pluralist. He did not believe he had exclusive access to the truth. He did not believe that Judaism had exclusive access to the truth. But he certainly saw religion as a pathway to answering questions. But it's actually the questions on some level that matter more than the answers, as we will see. The moment we become oblivious to ultimate questions, religion becomes irrelevant and its crisis sets in. The primary task of philosophy of religion is to rediscover the questions to which religion is an answer. The inquiry must proceed both by delving into the consciousness of man, as well as by delving into the teachings and attitudes of the religious tradition. He was really, really, really interested in the psyche, and he actually has a book, a short book, Who is Man? Who is man? Because you can't give a religion to people unless you understand people. There are dead thoughts and there are living thoughts. A dead thought has been compared to a stone which one may plant in the soil. Nothing will come out. A living thought is like a seed. In the process of thinking, an answer without a question is divine life. It may enter the mind, it will not penetrate the soul. It may become a part of one's knowledge. It will not come forth as a creative force. Let's read just the first paragraph of the next section. In our quest for forgotten questions, the method and spirit of philosophical inquiry are of greater importance than theology, which is essentially descriptive, normative, and historical. And Heschel doesn't like any of those things. Philosophy may be defined as the art of asking the right questions. One of the marks of philosophical thinking is that in contrast to poetry, and by the way, he was a poet. He wrote Yiddish poetry as a young man. A little bit was published, I think. He got good advice at some point, basically saying, you're a decent poet. You're never going to be particularly good. Focus more on theology. And Zalman Schachter Shalomi, if that name means much to you, toward the end of Heschel's life as a present, I think it was like the 40th anniversary of his arrival in America, something like that, gave him, or assigned him translations of the poetry from Yiddish into English. And it was a project which he continued even after Heschel passed away, and it's available now in English. I think it's called The Ineffable Name of God, Man, something like that. The Heschel's favorite English word is ineffable. It's everywhere. Okay. One of the marks of philosophical thinking is that, in contrast to poetry, for example, it is not a self-sufficing pouring forth of insight, but the explicit statement of a problem and the attempt to offer an answer to a problem. Theology starts with dogmas. Philosophy begins with problems. Philosophy sees the problem first. Theology as the answer in advance. We must not, however, disregard another important difference. Not only are the problems of philosophy not identical to the problems of religion, their status is not the same. Philosophy is, in a sense, a kind of thinking that has a beginning but no end. In it, the awareness of the problem outlives all solutions. Its answers are questions in disguise, every new answer giving rise to new questions. In religion, on the other hand, the mystery of the answer hovers over all questions. The mystery of the answer hovers over all questions. Philosophy deals with problems as universal issues. To religion, the universal issues are personal problems. Philosophy then stresses the primacy of the problem. Religion stresses the primacy of the person. So he does a double move, right? First, he puts philosophy over like theology, but then dismisses philosophy to some extent, replacing it with religion. Questions being at the core, but questions only come from people. And there is an answer. It's not that we keep on digging and digging and digging to the end of the world and then it keeps on going, but the answer is hovering, right? And I think hovering is an allusion to Bereshit, the idea of God hovering over the earth. Thoughts, concerns, how does it make you feel?
Confused.
Okay, what's confusing here?
It's everything that I was taught, and turning it around on its head. And I'm surprised in a way that he feels this way. I mean, it's, as you say, understandable because of the war and everything, but I'm not sure how to find myself in all the switching that he does, you know?
I find it in some way comforting because he's questioning. He's just not accepting everything as it is, as it was. It will continue and go forward, but he's questioning and making questions, I think, for others to now think about, to now, what do I think?
Okay. Let's turn the page. So we're still in God in Search of Man. GSM for Heschel for Schelians.
Yeah.
So page 46. As civilization advances, the sense of wonder declines. And wonder is key to his thought. Such decline is an alarming symptom of our state of mind. Mankind will not perish for want of information, but only for want of appreciation. The beginning of our happiness lies in the understanding that life without wonder is not worth living. What we lack is not a will to believe, but a will to wonder. Awareness of the divine begins with wonder. It is the result of what man does with his higher incomprehension. The greatest hindrance to such awareness is our adjustment to conventional notions, to mental cliches. Wonder, or radical amazement, a term that he makes up and is still in use. The state of maladjustment to words and notions is therefore a prerequisite for an authentic awareness of that which is. There is a story, I think I'm getting it right. Bill Lebo, who was, I just mentioned him, he was the dean for the first bit of my rabbinical studies. When he was interviewed as a student to see if he was going to be admitted to the school, Heschel was on the panel. And Heschel turns to him and he says, did you see God today? Thank God no one asked me that. And Bill Lebo responds something like, well, I left and I saw the sun was shining and the birds were singing, whatever it was. But did you see God today? And I remember that story very well because, and this is like the most mortifying moment of my life. When I was in my frosh week, basically, of rabbinical school, all the first year students were gathered together, and we were each given a pasuk earlier in the week that we were supposed to then present on for 2-3 minutes. I, of course, had the pasuk and totally forgot about it, and spent the morning, instead of doing orientation stuff and which would include me to the fact this is coming, running around trying to set a bank account and all those things which are difficult to do when you're not American. And I get in there and I can, they've basically everyone gone around. I see what's happening. I'm like, uh-oh. So I pull up this pasuk, and this story about Bilbo comes to mind because I'd read in this coffee table book that someone had given me called Rabbis. So I look at the pasuk, and okay, so I start telling this story, and I look up and I can tell everyone's really staring at me. And why are they really staring at me?
It's
because Bilbo's in the room. And I didn't notice. So I see him and I'm red as you cannot imagine. And I turned to him and I said, Rabbi Levo, perhaps you'd like to finish the story. To which he says, and I'll never forgive him for this, no, Adam, you're telling it very well. Why don't you continue? Anyway, radical amazement, this idea that you're filled with wonder. And I flew back from Ottawa this morning, and I was reviewing my notes for the class. And as I'm doing this, I'm looking out the window of the airplane, and just really trying to remember how remarkable it is to sit in this thing and get me from A to B in the air safely in an hour. Yeah. It's unbelievable. Heschel, by the way, I think came by boat.
So, Rabbi, do you mind if I ask? In reading this, I'm still trying to understand where is he going with it? What is he trying to get us to think about?
That's what the next 5 weeks are.
Yeah.
You have to stick with it, Eric.
No, all right, that's fine. I can accept that,
Yeah.
because this is all very interesting speculation, but where does it go?
Yeah. So the thing with Heschel is it's a lot of flowery language, and his detractors just will say things like he's a great poetic writer without actually dealing with the content. There is certainly content here. He was a difficult professor in the sense that he didn't write books on the history of Hasidism. He actually wasn't allowed to teach Hasidism for the first 10 or 15 years of his time at JTS. And he wasn't named full professor for a very long time. He really did struggle there. And he's not, he doesn't survey his students and find out, these are the questions. It's a lot of supposition. But I think he does have a good read on people. And he's trying to say, to be a religious person, and a lot of his writing isn't Jewish entirely, but he uses a lot of Jewish proof texts. He's saying to be a religious person means you have to begin from a place of wonder, a place of awe, which I might see here. Amazement is connected to that. And you have to understand the questions. Life begins with questions. Why am I here? What is my purpose? How do we live in this world? What are my requirements as a human being? And the answers are sort of less relevant to him.
So I don't know if I'm out of school in making this comment, but I had the privilege of sitting on the bima with Rabbi Saltzman for, I don't know, Shalom, for many years. And he used to refer to himself as orthopractic, but could never accept the sort of orthodox viewpoint because they didn't allow you to ask questions.
Right.
They didn't question whether the Torah was written by God or how the Torah was presented, and they wouldn't allow that kind of exploration. He's talking to me, who's not educated, so I guess he dumbed it down a little. But he talked about that really quite extensively because of this anomaly between the way he lived his life and how challenging he was of many things. And that was always his explanation. And guess what I'm learning is it probably came from having had some influence from Rabbi Heschel.
That I can't comment
No,
on.
of course
I
not.
don't know Rabbi Saltzman's theology really at all.
But he also talked about creating your own theology. So that also plays into what's happening here.
And, first I can speak to Heschel. For him, halacha was what you did as a Jew. Like that it was the edifice upon which Jewish life is constructed, and it's what links Jews together in Jew to do today, and what links Jews with their past. This is how Jews behave. But he was a staunch opponent to behaviorism, right? That this is all that you do, and being concerned about the minutia of how wide does your tefillin have to be? That those were questions which he wasn't a halachist. He didn't write shuvot. He didn't care about those things, but he was observant because that's how a Jew behaves, and that's
interesting. That's
what Judaism is. In terms of, and I'll make a point of including this in one of the future classes, and I'm paraphrasing because I'm not going to get exactly right. Heschel famously wrote, I think it's in God in Search of Man, as an account of revelation. The Torah itself is midrash. Okay, which is it's very Heschelian. It is, and it's very Hasidic in the sense that what did and I don't remember which Hasidic source it is. What did God say on Sinai? God said the Aleph of Anochi. Right, so the first word in the Ten Commandments is Anochi, and God said the Aleph. What sound does Aleph make? Nothing. Right. So what does that mean that God spoke the Aleph of Anochi? Right. I don't know. I don't know, but it makes you think. Radical amazement has a wider scope than any other act of man. While any act of perception or cognition has its object a selected segment of reality, radical amazement refers to all of reality, not only to what we see, but also the very act of seeing, as well as to our own selves, to the selves that see and are amazed at their ability to see. So radical amazement, and he gets into later on, the ability to be self-reflective, the consciousness that we can sit here and talk about this and recognize how crazy this whole thing is. Life, writing, asking deep questions, right? The thought that, and actually I think that as he talks about this a little bit, but the more and more we see humanity as simply a continuum of the animal world, the more I think Heschel becomes important as someone who writes with respect to the distinction of humans as opposed to animals. We don't think, I'm not, that apes can ask the kind of questions or think the kinds of thoughts that humans have.
Right.
Right? And in that way, we're not just evolved apes. We are something which is fundamentally different. And that there's already legal cases about this is a major thing out there in the world. Where do humans fit in terms of the animal kingdom? He quotes from Job here. He likes quoting from Job. No one else in the entire Jewish history likes quoting from Job.
Very funny.
Like, and when the Talmud quotes from Job, it's like, I couldn't find anything else. It's not entirely true. He quotes from Tehillim a lot. I know we don't have a lot of time. Okay, let's turn to page 98. The next time I'll remember to number the actual pages. Sorry about that. So this is still God in Search of Man. Because I think it was put in order by book, not necessarily by the continuum of ideas. Okay. The question of amazement. Greek philosophy began in a world without God. It could not accept the gods or the example of their conduct. Plato had to break with the gods and to ask, what is good? Thus the problem of values is born. And it was the idea of values that took the place of God. Plato let Socrates ask, what is good? But Moses' question was, what does God require of thee? There is no word in biblical Hebrew for doubt. There are many expressions of wonder. Just as in dealing with judgments, our starting point is doubt, Wonder is the biblical starting point in facing reality. And this is where you would normally quote from Tehillim, like, how the mountains praise God, how great are your works, just the whole world is in awe of God. The biblical man's sense for the mind-surpassing grandeur of reality prevented the power of doubt from setting up its own independent dynasty. Grandeur is also an important word for him. In fact, one of his collections, Moral Grandeur and something, which is a quotation from this telegram he sent to Kennedy. Doubt is an act in which the mind inspects its own ideas. Wonders is an act in which the mind confronts the universe. Radical skepticism is the outgrowth of settled conceit and self-reliance, yet there's no conceit in the prophets and no self-reliance in the psalmist. So it's not about I don't understand, it's just about everything is so amazing, right? That's the starting point. Doubt means that you think you have the truth, but you're not sure. Wonder is just everything. I can't stop looking at the world and just being amazed how much there is. Okay, I want to make sure we get at least one thing from something else.
So let me ask you, if you don't mind.
Yep.
It says, and so the biblical man never asks, is there a God? So what is he saying? That's not the way to ask the question?
Just the biblical man never thought to ask the question because the presence of God is so obvious.
I see.
Right? It stems from the wonder. You look at the world, you just know there's something. You can't deny that, from that kind of perspective.
Right. Okay. I get that.
Okay. So let's go to Man is Not Alone. It's page 13. It's toward the very end of your packet. The second last copy. A philosophy that begins with radical doubt ends in radical despair. So you can see that in a lot of ways, he's just, it's a continuing conversation from a previous book. It was the principle of dubito ut intelliga that prepared the soil for modern gospels of despair. Philosophy begins in wonder, in a state of mind, which you should like to call phlegmatism, as distinguished from skepticism. Even before we conceptualize what we perceive, we are amazed beyond words, beyond doubts. We might doubt anything, except we are struck with amazement. When in doubt, we raise questions. When in wonder, we do not even know how to ask a question. Doubts may be resolved. Radical amazement can never be erased. There is no answer in the world to man's radical wonder. Under the running sea of our theories and scientific explanations lies the aboriginal abyss of radical amazement. Right. Radical amazement has a wider scope than any other act of man. While any act of perception or cognition has as its object a selected segment of reality, radical amazement refers to all of reality. And then again, same language, what we see, ability to see, etc. And then I want to get one more thing. This is the next page. So this is a selection from Who is a Man? So it's page 54, embarrassment. Okay. Let not the wise man glory in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man glory in his might. But let him who glories in this, that he has a sense of ultimate embarrassment. How embarrassing for man to be the greatest miracle on earth and not to understand it. How embarrassing for man to live in the shadow of greatness and to ignore it, to be a contemporary of God and not to see it. Religion depends upon what man does with his ultimate embarrassment. It is the awareness the world is too great for him, the awareness of the grandeur and mystery of being, the awareness of being present to the unfolding of an inconceivable eternal saga. Embarrassment is the awareness of incongruity of character and challenge, of perceptivity and reality, of knowledge and understanding, of mystery and comprehension. Experiencing the evanescence of time, one realizes the absurdity of man's sense of sovereignty. In the face of the immense misery of the human species, one realizes the insufficiency of all human efforts to relieve it. In the face of one's inner anguish, one realizes the fallacy of absolute expediency. And I think that this is a natural extension of wonder and awe. The idea that he's looking at a people and they should be amazed and they don't even get it. They think that they're the kings and they're nothings. I think Heschel balances very well between the idea of, that it's the two pieces of paper, one in each pocket, being nothing but, dust and ashes, but also being, created in the image of God. That, we are nothings, but we are everything. And you need to come to it from a place, embarrassment is a very strong word. The recognition of the embarrassment should lead, which I'm going to say humility, which he doesn't mention here. Seeing how small we are, how remarkable the world is. And that's the foundation upon which Heschel really builds everything. It's 6:58. I know that Cantor is starting his thing in a couple of minutes. Next week, we'll meet again at the same time. We'll also, Anna's going to send something around. If there is consensus in the group that after next week, we can do a later time, like the 7:30 traditional slot. Only there's consensus, we'll move it. Originally, this wasn't a 6, there was this bit of a calendar confusion, our apologies. But I'll see everyone next week at 6, and you'll be receiving an email with all the sources numbered better before them. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.